I knew something was off the second I saw them. Two men standing at the end of my driveway, wearing what looked like security uniforms. Cheap ones. Their belts had handcuffs, radios, and something that looked like a badge clipped to their chests. But I'd lived in this neighborhood long enough to know one thing for sure. There was no HOA security in our area. At first, I thought they were salesmen or maybe lost delivery guys, but the way they stood, hands resting near their hips like they were carrying something, told me this was something else. They weren't here to sell magazines. I stepped out onto my porch, my pit bull, Diesel, following close behind. Diesel wasn't just a pet, he was family. A rescue I'd had for years, built like a tank, but the sweetest dog unless you gave him a reason not to be. The two men noticed him right away. One of them tensed up, shifting his weight like he wasn't too sure about standing there anymore. "Sir, we need to speak with you," the taller one said, taking a step forward. "We're with the Homeowners Association security team, and we have reports of some violations on your property." Violations. That was funny. I didn't belong to any HOA. My house sat on a piece of land just outside the main suburban developments, where people minded their business. No rules, no fees, no busybodies telling me what color I could paint my front door. So whatever these guys were selling, I wasn't buying. "You must have the wrong house," I said, keeping my voice even. "There's no HOA here." The shorter one, stockier and built like he spent too much time trying to squeeze into that uniform, shook his head. "That's incorrect. You're under the jurisdiction of the new HOA regulations, and we're here to enforce compliance." That's when I noticed it, the slight bulge under his vest holster he was carrying. My stomach tightened, but I kept my face neutral. I wasn't about to show these guys I knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't about some made-up HOA violations. This was a setup. Diesel let out a low growl, sensing the tension. The taller man took another step, and I casually placed a hand on Diesel's back, giving him a light scratch, our silent signal. If I needed him to move, he would. "Look, I don't know what kind of scam you two are running, but I suggest you move along," I said, my voice steady. "I don't do business with people who show up uninvited." The taller one exhaled sharply, glancing at his partner like they had expected this to go differently. Then, without missing a beat, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a laminated card, holding it up like it meant something. "This is an official HOA citation," he said. "You have outstanding fines that need to be addressed. We can handle this right now, or we'll have to escalate the situation." Fines. Citations. This was getting ridiculous. I took a slow step forward, just enough to make it clear I wasn't intimidated, but not enough to spook them. "You're gonna have to take that citation and shove it back where it came from," I said. That was the moment things changed. The shorter guy reached for his radio, pressing the button like he was calling for backup. "We have a non-compliant resident," he said, his voice sharp. "Proceeding with escalation." Escalation. That's when I felt it, the shift in the air. The unspoken moment when a situation turns from weird to dangerous. I wasn't about to let that happen. Without breaking eye contact, I reached behind me, feeling the cool metal grip of my Desert Eagle resting in its holster. I never carried to show off. Never to intimidate. But I carried because, sometimes, trouble finds you whether you're looking for it or not. Diesel tensed beside me, his muscles coiling like a spring. The fake cops had no idea what they'd just walked into. And in the next few seconds they were about to find out. I kept my hand resting near the grip of my Desert Eagle, not drawing it but making sure it was there if I needed it. My heartbeat was steady, my breathing even. I had dealt with trouble before. People who thought they could walk onto my property and push me around. But these guys were different. They weren't just trying to intimidate me. They were testing me, waiting to see how I'd react. The shorter guy's fingers stayed on his radio, his thumb hovering over the button. He wasn't actually calling anyone, I realized. There was no static, no voice on the other end. It was a bluff. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the taller one said, taking another step forward. "We can settle this right now. Just cooperate, and we'll be on our way." Diesel let out another growl, low and deep, his body shifting just slightly in front of me. The taller guy hesitated for just a second before recovering, trying to act like he wasn't bothered by the 100-pound pit bull staring him down. But I saw the way his eyes flicked to Diesel's teeth. He was nervous. "You're not real cops," I said, my voice calm but firm. "And you're definitely not with the HOA. So let's cut the act. Tell me what you're really doing here." The shorter guy smirked, crossing his arms. "We've already told you, sir. You've got outstanding violations, and we're authorized to issue fines. If necessary, we can detain you until the matter is resolved." "Detain me?" I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "You really think you can do that?" Neither of them answered. I glanced at their uniforms again, taking in the details. The patches on their sleeves looked official from a distance, but up close they were slightly off, too generic, no real insignia. Their belts had the usual gear, handcuffs, radios, even what looked like pepper spray, but I had serious doubts about their authority to use any of it. I decided to push. "Go ahead then," I said, spreading my arms slightly. "If you really think you have the right, arrest me." The taller one hesitated. The shorter one shifted his stance like he was considering his options. That told me everything I needed to know. They weren't here for fines. They were looking for something, maybe testing me, maybe trying to see if they could get inside my house. Either way, they had picked the wrong guy. Diesel took another step forward, his growl growing louder. That was my final warning. I didn't need to draw my weapon unless they gave me a real reason to, but Diesel? He had his own way of handling situations. The taller guy took a slow step back. "Sir, we don't want any trouble." "Then leave." The shorter one didn't budge. His eyes flicked to my right side, where my hand was still near my holster. He wasn't stupid. He knew what I was carrying, and he was trying to decide if pushing this any further was worth it. "You think we're scared of a dog and a gun?" he asked, his voice cocky but forced. "I don't think anything," I said. "I just know this isn't going the way you planned." A long silence stretched between us. Then, without another word, the taller guy grabbed his partner's arm. "Let's go." The shorter one didn't move at first, but when he saw his partner turning away, he finally backed off. He gave me one last hard look, then turned and followed. They walked back to the edge of my property, climbed into a black SUV, and pulled away without another word. I didn't move until they were completely out of sight. Diesel stayed tense for another few seconds, ears forward, body rigid. Then, finally, he relaxed. I gave him a pat on the head. "Good boy." I stepped back inside and locked the door behind me, my mind already turning. Who were those guys? And what did they really want? I grabbed my phone and pulled up my security camera feed. The footage showed them arriving, stepping out of their vehicle, and walking up my driveway. The SUV had no markings, no official plates, just a regular dark-colored vehicle. That confirmed it. These guys weren't real enforcers of anything. I replayed the footage, watching their body language. The way they moved, the way they talked. It wasn't polished enough to be law enforcement, but it also wasn't amateur. These guys had done this before. The question was, why? I leaned against the counter, running through possibilities. Maybe they were scammers trying to trick people into paying fake fines. But that didn't add up. They hadn't asked for money. They hadn't even pushed the fake citation too hard. It was almost like they were trying to provoke me. Diesel sat by my feet, looking up at me with his big brown eyes. He could sense my tension. I exhaled slowly. "Guess we're gonna have to do some digging, buddy." I pulled out my laptop and started searching for reports of fake security teams in the area. Nothing immediately jumped out. No warnings, no news stories. That made me even more suspicious. I clicked through different local forums, checking for anything unusual. And then I found something. A small post buried in a neighborhood watch group. Saw two guys in fake security uniforms going door to door. They tried to tell me I owed fines. "We don't even have an HOA. Called the sheriff's office, but they were gone before anyone could check it out." I scrolled down. Few replies. Similar encounters. Same vague uniforms. Same black SUV. This wasn't random. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. Something was going on. And I had a feeling I hadn't seen the last of them. The next morning, I woke up with that same uneasy feeling lingering in my chest. Diesel lay at the foot of my bed, ears twitching every now and then, still on high alert even in his sleep. He had sensed something was off with those fake HOA cops, just like I had. And if my gut was right, this wasn't over. I made my way to the kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, and sat at the table with my laptop open. I pulled up the neighborhood forum again, rereading the posts I had found the night before. A few new replies had been added overnight. More people mentioning similar encounters. One comment caught my eye. They came to my house 2 days ago. Same fake uniforms, same SUV. When I refused to pay, they started asking weird questions like who lives in my house, how often I'm home. Felt more like they were sizing me up than trying to collect money. That sent a chill through me. This wasn't just a scam. It wasn't about fake fines or scare tactics. These guys were looking for something. Or someone. Diesel sat up, stretching before hopping down and padding over to me. He rested his head against my leg, his warm breath heavy against my knee. I absent-mindedly scratched behind his ears, my mind still working through the pieces of the puzzle. I decided to call someone who might have more insight. My buddy Jake had done private security work for years. He knew all the tricks, all the scams, all the ways people tried to get into places they weren't supposed to be. Sounds like they're either running recon or testing for weak spots, Jake said after I told him everything. Could be a burglary crew seeing who's an easy target. Then why didn't they just case the house and leave? Asked. Why try to provoke me? Jake was quiet for a second. Because they wanted to see how you'd react. Some guys like to know what they're walking into. Who's gonna fight back, who's an easy mark? That thought made my skin crawl. I wasn't some helpless homeowner who would panic and hand over cash at the first sign of trouble. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe I hadn't reacted the way they expected. You should file a report, Jake said. At least get it on record. I exhaled slowly, glancing at the door. Yeah, I might do that. But I wasn't ready to involve the cops just yet. Instead, I decided to do some recon of my own. That afternoon, I took a slow drive around the neighborhood, keeping an eye out for that black SUV. I checked the side streets, the gas station on the corner, even the parking lot near the strip mall. Nothing. If they were still hanging around, they were keeping out of sight. But then, just as I was about to give up and head home, I saw something. Parked on a side street, half hidden behind a row of trees, was a black SUV. It wasn't the exact same one from yesterday. This one had a dent near the rear bumper, but it was close enough to make my pulse quicken. I pulled over down the street and watched for a minute. The windows were tinted dark, making it impossible to see inside. I checked my mirrors, making sure I wasn't being watched in return. Then, just as I was debating whether to get closer, the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. Not one of the guys from yesterday. This one was older, maybe mid-50s. Dressed in plain clothes. He looked around, then pulled out his phone and started typing. After a minute, he put the phone to his ear, talking to someone as he leaned against the SUV. Who was he? Another fake cop? Or something else entirely? I grabbed my phone and snapped a quick picture before pulling away. I had no idea what I was dealing with yet, but one thing was becoming clear. This wasn't just about me. Back at home, I uploaded the picture to the neighborhood forum. Anyone recognize this guy? Saw him near the same type of black SUV the fake HOA cops were driving. Within minutes I got a reply. I know him. He came by my house last week. Said he was with a private security company, but something felt off. The second reply came in right after. That's him. He was asking weird questions about my property. Said he was doing a safety check for homeowners. My stomach tightened. This was bigger than I thought. Someone or some group was working the entire neighborhood. Fake security, fake violations, fake safety checks. But for what? I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. And that's when I heard it. Car slowing down outside. I stood up, moving to the window. Diesel was already at the door, ears perked, body tense. I pulled the curtain back just enough to see. Black SUV. Not parked. Not stopping. Just driving by, slow enough to be watching. Then it sped up and disappeared down the road. I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening on the curtain. This wasn't random. They were watching me now. I stood by the window, heart pounding, watching the SUV disappear down the road. Diesel let out a low growl. His body tense as he stared at the door like he expected someone to barge in at any second. I didn't like this. Not one bit. First, they came to my house pretending to be HOA cops. Then, I catch someone else linked to them lurking around the neighborhood. And now, they were circling my street like they were keeping tabs on me. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to think. If they wanted to break in, they wouldn't be this obvious. If they wanted to scare me off, they had to know by now that wasn't going to happen. So what were they after? I grabbed my phone and checked the neighborhood forum again. More people had chimed in. A few had spotted similar SUVs in different parts of town. Some had even been approached by the fake security teams, though no one had been outright attacked or robbed. It was all just watching, pressuring, feeling people out. Then one post stopped me cold. I think they tried to get into my neighbor's house. I heard a noise last night, then saw someone sneaking around the side of their yard. When I turned on my porch light, they took off. Neighbor says they never saw anything, but something feels off. That was it. They weren't just testing people at their doors. They were picking their targets. I pushed away from the table and grabbed my keys. If they thought I was just going to sit around and wait for them to make a move, they had another thing coming. I drove through the neighborhood, eyes scanning every street. I didn't have a solid plan yet, just a need to see something to catch them in the act. I passed by the gas station, the strip mall, the side streets where I had spotted them before. Nothing. But I knew they were out there. I was about to turn back when I noticed a familiar shape parked just off the main road. A black SUV, half hidden in the shadows behind a row of trees. The engine was running. Someone was inside. I slowed down, pulling over a few spots away, keeping my headlights dim. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I watched. A figure sat in the driver's seat, unmoving, waiting. Then the passenger door opened. A second man stepped out, dressed in dark clothes, and disappeared behind the houses. My pulse quickened. They were doing it again. I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture of the SUV before stepping out of my truck. I wasn't about to go charging in after the guy, but I needed to see what he was up to. I moved carefully, staying in the shadows, keeping my distance. The man weaved through the yards, moving with purpose. He wasn't just wandering. He had a destination. Then he stopped. I barely breathed as I watched him crouch near the side of a house, just beyond the reach of the porch light. He pulled something from his pocket, a flashlight, maybe a tool, and leaned in toward the window. My gut told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't random. They weren't just looking for easy marks. They were after something specific. I reached for my phone, ready to call someone. Jake, the cops, anyone, when my foot nudged against a loose rock on the pavement. It barely made a sound, but the man's head snapped up instantly. For a split second we locked eyes. Then he bolted. I took off after him. He was fast, but I was faster. I tore through the yard, closing the gap between us as he made a break for the street. The black SUV was already moving, rolling forward to pick him up. I wasn't going to let that happen. Just as he reached the curb, I lunged, grabbing the back of his jacket. He twisted, shoving me hard, but I held on. We stumbled, nearly hitting the pavement, but I managed to keep my balance. "Who are you?" I growled, tightening my grip. He didn't answer. Instead, he yanked something from his pocket and swung it toward me, a small object glinting under the streetlight. I barely had time to react before I felt it slash across my arm. Pain shot through me, hot and sharp, but I didn't let go. I grabbed his wrist, twisting hard, and the object, a pocket knife, clattered to the ground. He swore, trying to break free, but I wasn't about to let him go now. The SUV skidded to a stop just a few feet away, its back door flying open. And then everything happened at once. The driver jumped out. The guy in my grip twisted again, this time throwing his full weight into it. I lost my hold for half a second, just long enough for him to yank away and dive toward the SUV. He scrambled inside, the door slamming shut behind him. I reached for my phone, snapping a final picture as the tires screeched and the SUV tore off into the night. I stood there, breathing hard, my arm burning where the knife had grazed me. My fingers tightened around my phone as I looked down at the screen. The picture was blurry, but clear enough to make out part of the license plate. I exhaled slowly, my heart still hammering. This wasn't just some random scam. This was something bigger, something organized. And now they knew I was onto them. I stood there under the dim glow of the streetlights, gripping my phone as the black SUV disappeared into the night. My arm throbbed where the knife had grazed me, but I barely felt it. My mind was racing. The guy had fought hard to get away. That wasn't just a petty scammer running from a confrontation. That was someone with something to hide. Something big. And now they knew I wasn't going to back off. Diesel would be restless at home, and I knew I needed to get back before they got any ideas about circling my house again. As I drove, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see headlights tailing me. But the road stayed empty, the quiet stretching out too long, too unnatural. I pulled into my driveway and barely had time to step out before Diesel was at the door, growling low. He knew something was up. His ears were back, his stance stiff. He wasn't just excited to see me, he was on edge. That's when I saw it. A small, folded piece of paper wedged into my front door frame. I pulled it out slowly, my pulse hammering. There was no writing on the outside, just a single sheet of paper, creased like it had been folded in a hurry. I unfolded it with one hand, my other instinctively reaching for the grip of my Desert Eagle tucked at my side. The message was short. Sloppy handwriting like someone had written it in a rush. Back off. You don't know what you're getting into. I exhaled, forcing my grip to loosen on the gun. Diesel sniffed at the paper, letting out a soft whine. Someone had been here. Someone had been close enough to leave this note without me knowing. I turned, scanning the street, the shadows near the houses, the darkened corners where someone could be watching. But there was nothing. Just silence. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, but the weight of that note sat heavy in my chest. This wasn't just about scaring homeowners into paying fake fees. This was organized. These guys had a purpose, a reason for being here. And whatever it was, they didn't want me digging. But that note, it had the opposite effect. I grabbed my laptop, pulling up the photo I had taken of the SUV's license plate. It was only a partial plate, but it was something. I sent it to Jake along with a quick message. Got a piece of a plate. Think you can track it? Seconds later, my phone buzzed. Jake's response was short but telling. On it. Also, check your security cams. My stomach dropped. I had almost forgotten about the cameras. The system was basic, just a few small cameras covering the front and back of the house, mostly for package theft, but it might have caught something. I opened the app and scrolled through the footage. The timestamp showed that the note had been left less than 15 minutes before I got home. I hit play. A dark figure moved at the edge of the frame, keeping to the shadows near my porch. The camera wasn't high quality, but I could see enough. The person was wearing a hood, moving quickly, like they didn't want to linger. They reached up, tucked the note into the doorframe, then turned back toward the street. Then they paused. For a second, just a second, they turned their head slightly, and the camera caught part of their face. The angle was bad, the lighting worse, but something about them made my breath catch. It wasn't just some random thug. It wasn't one of the guys from the fake HOA scam. I knew this face, but I couldn't place it. I rewound, zooming in as much as I could, trying to sharpen the image. There was something familiar in the shape of the jaw, the way they moved, the way they hesitated before leaving. And then it hit me. A few weeks ago, before all of this started, I had seen this guy in my neighborhood. Not as part of any scam, not sneaking around, but talking to one of my neighbors. Mr. Holloway. The old man who lived 2 houses down. The guy who always waved when he saw me. Who always made small talk about the weather or the best time to fertilize his lawn. He had been talking to this man. And not just in passing. It had looked serious. I sat back, my mind spinning. Had Mr. Holloway been involved in this? Or was he another target? I needed to talk to him. The next morning, just as the sun was rising, I walked down the street. Holloway's house was quiet, the curtains drawn. I knocked once, then again, waiting. No answer. I tried calling his name, but there was nothing. Just an eerie silence that settled over the house like a thick fog. Something was wrong. I stepped back, scanning the front yard, the porch, the windows. That's when I noticed it. The smallest detail, something I wouldn't have looked twice at if I wasn't already on edge. The doorknob. There were scratches near the lock. Fresh ones. Like someone had forced their way inside. A cold feeling crawled up my spine. Diesel shifted beside me, ears perked, sensing my unease. I took a breath, my fingers twitching near my sidearm. I had been so focused on watching them. I never stopped to think that maybe, just maybe, they had been watching me too. I stood there on Mr. Holloway's porch, my heart pounding, the morning air thick with tension. The scratches on the doorknob weren't just old wear and tear. They were fresh. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. I knocked again, harder this time, calling out, "Mr. Holloway? You home?" No answer. Something in my gut told me this wasn't just a case of him stepping out for coffee. I glanced around, checking the quiet street. No sign of the black SUV. No movement behind the curtains of the other houses. But that didn't mean I wasn't being watched. I tested the doorknob. Unlocked. Diesel let out a low whine, sensing my hesitation. I knew better than to walk into someone's house uninvited, but something about this felt wrong. Mr. Holloway had lived here for years. He was careful, the type to double-check his locks and leave a porch light on at night. I pushed the door open slowly. Inside, the air was still. The house was neat, just as I remembered, but something was off. A chair in the living room was tipped slightly out of place. A drawer in the hallway left open just an inch too far. Small things, subtle, but enough to tell me someone had been searching for something. And then I heard it. A faint noise from the back of the house. Diesel's ears perked. I moved carefully, one step at a time, following the sound down the hall. My fingers hovered near my sidearm, but I didn't draw it yet. Not until I knew what I was dealing with. The door to the back room was slightly ajar. Pushed it open. And there, sitting in a chair, hands tied, was Mr. Holloway. His eyes widened when he saw me. "You need to get out of here," he rasped, his voice hoarse. Before I could respond, movement in my peripheral vision made me spin. A man lunged from the shadows. I barely had time to react before he grabbed for me, but I moved faster, ducking as he swung something. A wooden baton, maybe a pipe. It whistled past my head, smashing into the doorframe. Diesel snarled and lunged, but the man kicked out, knocking him back. I didn't hesitate. I threw my weight forward, ramming into him, sending us both crashing into the wall. He grunted, trying to regain his footing, but I caught his wrist, twisting hard. The weapon clattered to the floor. He wasn't just some hired thug. He moved like someone who knew what he was doing. Trained. Controlled. His face, now that I could see it up close, was the same one from my security footage. The man who had left the note. And now I had him. He struggled, but Diesel was back on his feet, teeth bared, blocking the only exit. "Who sent you?" I growled, my grip tightening. The man smirked, like he wasn't worried at all. "You already know." My stomach twisted. The fake HOA scam. The break-ins. The SUV stalking my house. This wasn't just about scamming homeowners. It wasn't even about money. It was about Mr. Holloway. I turned to the old man, his face pale, his breath shaky. "What do they want from you?" Mr. Holloway exhaled slowly. "It's not what I have," he said. "It's what I know." The man in my grip let out a bitter chuckle. And now you know too. Before I could process that, a new sound cut through the tension. Tires screeching. More than one vehicle. I pulled back the curtain just in time to see two black SUVs rolling up outside. Doors opening. More men stepping out. They weren't here to talk. Time to go, I muttered. I moved fast, grabbing a knife from the kitchen counter and cutting the ropes binding Mr. Holloway's hands. He winced but stood, rubbing his wrists. They're not going to let us walk out of here, he said grimly. They don't have a choice, I replied. Diesel growled, pacing near the door. We didn't have much time. The man I had restrained gave me a knowing look, like he already knew how this would end. You should have backed off, he said. I ignored him. I wasn't backing off. Not now. I wasn't entirely sure what Mr. Holloway knew, what secret had made him a target, but one thing was clear. These guys had been operating in the shadows for a long time. And now, for the first time, someone had pushed back. I had pushed back. The front door rattled as someone tested the handle. I took one last deep breath, adjusting my grip on my sidearm. Then, with Diesel at my side, I stepped forward and opened the door. The front door swung open, and for a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The men outside were expecting to take control, to intimidate us into surrendering. But they hadn't counted on me being ready, or on Diesel's low, dangerous growl slicing through the air like a warning bell. The man closest to the door took a step forward, his face unreadable, but I could see the tension in his stance. He wasn't expecting me to stand my ground. Behind him, the others fanned out, their movements controlled, professional. Mr. Holloway was rigid beside me, but I could feel the shift in his energy. He wasn't just a scared old man caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been holding something back, something big. You know how this ends, the man at the front said. His voice calm, almost casual. Just hand him over. I didn't move. You keep saying I should back off, but you broke into my house. You left threats on my door. You don't get to pretend you have the upper hand anymore. The man sighed like he was dealing with a stubborn child. You don't understand what you're in the middle of. Then explain it, I challenged. His jaw tightened. It's not my job to explain things to you. I could hear the SUVs idling behind them, engines running like they expected this to be over quickly. I glanced past the men, scanning the street. A neighbor's curtain twitched, but nobody came outside. They knew better. Mr. Holloway took a step forward. His voice steady despite the fear I knew he was feeling. This isn't about a fake HOA. It's about land, real land, not just fees and fines. They've been using the scam as a front, but the real plan is to push people out. Anyone who refuses, they disappear. The man in front didn't deny it. My grip tightened on my sidearm. So what happens now? For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. This wasn't going the way they'd planned. Maybe they expected me to cave, to step aside. Maybe they thought I'd be too scared to stand against them. But I wasn't alone. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement down the street. A squad car rolling up, lights off, moving slow. Jake had come through. I had sent him the partial plate, and he must have put the pieces together fast. The men outside hadn't noticed yet. I exhaled, slow and controlled. Looks like you're out of time. The leader finally followed my gaze, and the moment he spotted the police car, his whole posture changed. No more confidence, no more smug control. The SUVs revved, and the men hesitated, glancing between each other. They were trained, sure, but they weren't about to get caught on camera taking this further. Let's go, the man muttered to his team, stepping back. One by one they retreated, climbing into the SUVs. The engines roared, and just like that, they peeled away, tires screeching, disappearing down the street. Relief flooded my chest, but I didn't lower my guard yet. Not until the squad car pulled up and Jake stepped out. His expression serious. You good? He asked. His eyes flicking between me, Mr. Holloway, and the empty street. He nodded. For now. Jake exhaled, shaking his head. Took some digging, but your hunch was right. This scam goes way deeper than some fake HOA. These guys have been targeting neighborhoods, forcing people out under legal loopholes and intimidation tactics. A few complaints popped up in other states, but nothing stuck. Nobody's been able to prove a connection, until now. Mr. Holloway let out a weary breath. I knew something was off, but I didn't think it ran this deep. Jake glanced at me. I sent everything I found to some people higher up. This isn't over, but they're gonna be looking into it. And after tonight, those guys know they can't operate in the shadows anymore. I nodded, feeling the tension in my chest finally start to ease. Good. Jake smirked. You always manage to find trouble, don't you? Shrugged. I don't go looking for it. It just shows up at my door. Mr. Holloway let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. I guess I owe you one. I glanced at Diesel, who was sitting at my side, still alert but calmer now. You can owe it to him. Jake sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Well, I've got paperwork to fill out, and you've got a mess to clean up. But hey, next time someone tries to run an illegal operation in your neighborhood, maybe let the authorities handle it first. I grinned. Where's the fun in that? Jake rolled his eyes, but there was amusement in them. Stay out of trouble. He got back in his car, pulling away, leaving me and Mr. Holloway standing in the cool night air. The street was quiet again. Normal. Like none of this had happened. Mr. Holloway sighed, rubbing his hands together. Guess I should probably start looking into moving. I frowned. You don't have to. He smiled faintly. No, but I think I want to. Some fights aren't worth sticking around for. Understood. We said our goodbyes, and I watched as he walked back to his house. The scratches on his doorknob were still there, but everything else was still standing. That was something. As I headed back home, Diesel trotting beside me, I let out a slow breath. The night was quiet again. For now.